Hello, I'm Croll, and I'm honoured that my book, Shaped by Silence, Stories from Inmates of the Good Shepherd Laundries and Reformatories, has been nominated for the Atlantic Book Award for Scholarly Writing. Shaped by Silence brings together 5 stories of women from Ireland, Canada, and Australia, whose lives were shaped by forced confinement in Magdalen laundries, operated by the Roman Catholic Order of Sisters of the Good Shepherd. This order of nuns ran these prison-style laundries transnationally from the 1830s until the mid-1990s. Their stated purpose was to bring girls and women from the most shameful disorders to a chaste life. Through religious doctrination and forced cleaning in industrial-style laundries, those in their charge were meant to be reshaped to fit prevailing religious and social perceptions of virtuous or pure womanhood. Inmates operated under a rigid rule of silence, and so all attempts to communicate with one another without permission were punished. In addition to the control and safeguarding of sexual mores, the Good Shepherd reformatories served as dumping grounds for society's unwanted, the girls and women whose society wished to see disappear. Those whose circumstances and identities were complicated, for example, by their intersections with poverty, their immigrant status, or indigeneity, were especially vulnerable to being confined therein, as were those living with sexually and physically abusive fathers and stepfathers. Those I interviewed had been child inmates of these reformatories between the 1930s and the 1960s. It's their stories that form the substance of Shaped by Silence. One of these stories, an Atlantic Canadian one, was shared with me by Chaparral Bowman. I want to convey a few selections from her chapter to you. In the early 1950s, Chaparral ran away from the St. John, New Brunswick Good Shepherd Reformatory and Industrial Refuge Laundry. Chaparral had been born in 1934 to Dulcinea, then 13 and pregnant from a rape. Dulcinea's parents sent her to the reformatory upon the advice of a priest. This detail is really important. It's significant to Chaparral, because, as she said repeatedly to me, it was evidence that her mother wasn't put in there by law. Her mother, she repeatedly told me, had committed no crime. And yet, after Dulcinea delivered Chaparral, she remained confined in the laundry for years until she was no longer able to work. Chaparral also was detained there for the first 18 years of her life. Chaparral attributed her own capacity to endure to what she called a surviving spirit, which she credits to her ancestry. My ancestors, she told me, were First Nation survivors big time. Chaparral knew little of her family, except that they were of Indigenous descent and had lived on a reserve on the outskirts of Fredericton before moving to St. John. As a child, Chaparral worked along Dulcinea in the laundry and only learned she was her mother when Chaparral was a young teen. Before this discovery, Chaparral sometimes joined the other inmates who, steered by the nuns, cruelly derided and abused Dulcinea, who was punched and hit and ridiculed regularly. In the laundry, pregnant, unmarried girls were the scum of the earth, said Chaparral, and an Aboriginal girl was even more so. While Chaparral's small role in Dulcinea's abuse ceased with the discovery that Dulcinea was her mother, it nonetheless created lifelong feelings of guilt and remorse for her. Chaparral also deeply regretted that she never grew to love her mother. One outcome of being institutionalized with the Good Shepherds was that Chaparral was left with a lifelong feeling of, as she said, not belonging anywhere, of having little personal substance. She had no sense of ownership of either speech or space, and no sense of control of her time. No prospect of anything, personal or individual. You had no identity. You see, if you were bad and you promised to be good, they'd change your name. There was no you. There was everybody. I was baptized Georgina, I was baby Jane, I had Jean, I had Loretta, I was Gemma, I was Maria, I was Bernice, back to Jean, back to Loretta, and when I finally left, I've been Jean for about 5 years. So there is no you, there is no Jean. She was part of that lineup. Everything the nuns say is our. There was nothing personal. Since a collective identity was all that Chaparral knew as a child, she never questioned the fact that even her name was not hers to possess. Chaparral developed a deeply fixed perception of herself as damaged and distorted because of these childhood institutional abuses. The Good Shepherd nuns offered Chaparral no validation of her individuality, for attention to the individual contravened the reform methods. Chaparral knew that she was one of those children, she told me, one of those who were considered to have been born bad and were made to atone for their mother's out-of-wedlock pregnancies. I think, she said, but I'm not sure, that this is how the slave mentality was ingrained, by them making us feel that we were worthless and only worthwhile to the church as workers. That's how we could make restitution for what our parents did, was by being, good slaves. As a young child, Chaparral figured out that as the lowest of the low, if she were to be considered worthy in the nuns' eyes, it would be through her work contributions. With no one to modify or correct her perceptions, Chaparral's frightening self-image and self-evaluation grew in power and became fixed realities. Chaparral described, for example, how she came to wear on her body the stigmas such as sinner and bastard that the nuns regularly berated and leveled her with. As a young child, too young to understand fully what these labels meant, she filled in the blanks herself. She described for me how the dominant view of her character became instilled and then reinforced in her in what she called a self-perception of being broken up and upside down. As a young child in a mirrorless institution, Chaparral found confirmation of their judgment in a toilet bowl reflection. When she stared into the refracted water of the toilet bowl, she saw that her face was broken up and in pieces. This reflection was reinforced when at supper, Chaparral looked at the back of her spoon and noticed that she was upside down on the back and right side up but squished on the front. And I thought in my child's mind that I was broken and I was upside down, and I carried that, and I wouldn't look at anybody. That was what I thought everyone could see. The sense of shame the Good Shepherds intended inmates to carry has been a means of silencing them. So too was the denial of self-reflection that the nuns instilled in their charges, and indeed operated under themselves. The absence of mirrors in these Good Shepherd institutions stands as a metaphor for this renunciation of self-reflection. Dogma, work, and prayer, not inter-reflection, form the supposed route to salvation. Consequently, for all who passed through these institutions, at least all of those I interviewed, the consistent outcome was self-estrangement, a condition that made recovery and self-understanding a long and complex process. The internalized stigmatization that went along with their indoctrination as bad girls and fallen women served only to keep them quiet until some regained the fortitude to make their voices heard. Due to a public inability or unwillingness to recognize the unjust conditions under which they were held, the voices of a daring few are all that is left to represent all of those who have been shut down by the combined forces of the Good Shepherds and the state. These accounts pave the way for the acknowledgement of theirs and others' suffering, their toil in what are now known as religious sweatshops. The troubled memories they carry as a result speak to us of the importance of attending to past cruelties and require proper inquiries by each of the nations who permitted the laundries to take hold as a lawful and acceptable form of girls' and women's incarceration. Thanks so much for tuning in.